Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
Fall is officially here, and we are back with another great interview for you. Today, we are excited to welcome Joe Teirab back to The Breakdown. Joe is an attorney and formerly a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minneapolis. Joe last joined us while he was the 2024 Republican nominee for U.S. Congress in Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District. With Joe, we are going to break down his op-ed in the Star Tribune titled, Safety Takes a Backseat. Moriarty's traffic stop policy is foolish. We will tap into Joe's experience prosecuting at the state and federal level and discuss why this policy makes us less safe rather than more. Then we will get into Joe's new role as the Minnesota State co-chair for U.S. term limits. Following our time with Joe, Michael and I will break down a panel conversation this week, including former Governor Tim Pawlenty and State Senators Zach Duckworth and Julia Coleman, where they chatted about the future of the Republican Party here in Minnesota. Thank you for joining us today and enjoy the show. We are excited to welcome Joe Tera back to the podcast in a different kind of light that we're going to be chatting with you today. Want to talk to you about your recent op-ed in the Star Tribune titled Safety Takes a Backseat, Moriarty's Traffic Stop Policy is Foolish. So start by explaining to us the new policy for Mary Moriarty that she has enacted in Hennepin County and what this means and why you decided that you wanted to respond. A whole lot of there, but give it to us.
For sure. Well, and thanks a ton for having me back on, Becky and Michael. Mary Moriarty has done a bunch of stupid things, and this one maybe takes the cake. So she came out with a couple of weeks ago a policy, and of course she's the Hennepin County attorney, so the top prosecutor in Minnesota's largest county. And she said, hey, look, we're not going to charge felony-level crimes if they originally stem from a low-level traffic violation. So in other terms, in other ways, if a Hennepin County Sheriff's deputy pulls someone over for expired tabs or even a typical speeding or rolling through a stop sign, and they somehow find an illegal gun in the car in the pursuit of their investigation or a large amount of methamphetamine, she's just by policy not going to charge it, subject to a few small exceptions. And so this is totally backwards. It's terrible for public safety. Many police organizations have come out against this. I, as a former state and federal prosecutor, had numerous cases that started from fairly innocuous, benign, okay, someone pulls someone over for going over the speed limit or expired tabs, and it balloons into this much bigger case. And so it's just terrible for public policy.
So walk us through, play devil's advocate a little bit. How did Moriarty and her office come to this? Is it because of the thought that there is an inherent bias and that is the reason for some of these stops and we're aiming to prevent that? And if that's the case, why do you think that doesn't work?
Yeah, so what Moriarty claims, she claims a few things. She claims first that she's speaking on behalf of Black and brown people, which I guess I take offense to that as someone who's Black myself. I think this is horrible for people in communities that are facing high levels of crime. She says it, okay, because police may stop people from different communities at higher rates, but we have to look at why is there higher levels of crime, unfortunately, in Black and brown communities. Black and brown people are disproportionately higher victims of crime. And so what can we do to actually stop that? And all the data that I credit looks at a larger police presence is going to reduce crime. And so I think this policy is just not going to get to the ends that she wants it to get to, because these low-level traffic violations sometimes do lead to guns being confiscated, meth being confiscated, what have you. She also says, for example, that, because these traffic stops, 99% of them don't lead to contraband. So let's just not charge felonies that come from low-level traffic violations. And like I said in my op-ed, that's like saying, okay, TSA metal detectors only discover contraband, in this very small percentage, maybe less than 1% of the time people walk through them. So let's just get rid of metal detectors altogether. That's just bonkers. It's terrible logic, and it doesn't work out. And sadly, the people of Hennepin County and Minnesota are going to suffer.
You mentioned the kind of statistics of people of color being more often victims of crime as well. Your op-ed points to a couple statistics, one being that Black Americans are about 14% of the population, but account for 54% of homicide victims. And that a recent 2020 Gallup poll found that 81% of Black respondents actually wanted police presence to stay the same or increase. Walk us through a little bit of your findings and what you know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just looking at poll after poll, and that was just one poll I cited, I think there are folks in some communities like Mary Moriarty's who are very detached from what people actually want in the Black and brown communities. And she believes, I think, because she's in this ivory tower and she has this semblance of what is actually going to lead to public safety, but maybe people like herself aren't going to feel the consequences of her policies. And so I think lots of people in our community and many communities want the same or more police presence because it's kind of common sense. And I cited this that, hey, look, policies shape behavior or police presence shapes behavior. A lot of the data shows that, hey, look, if you see a police officer, you're going to end up changing your behavior, right? You're going to less likely commit a crime. And so that's why Minneapolis Police Department themselves have done this Operation Safe Summer where they strategically send more police officers to areas that are high in crime, aka hotspots policing. I mean, this is a big thing in policing, and Mary Moriarty wants to cite these things, these studies that say, well, it's not effective. It's just malarkey. It is effective. It jives with common sense. I also talked about, hey, how policies shape behavior. A while back, police departments by policy stopped chasing suspects who flee. And in some circumstances, it is probably right to hem some of those policies down so we don't have wild police chases that end up harming the public. But when you put out by policy that police are going to stop chasing people, the criminals learn that. They know that. I mean, it's remarkable in my time as a prosecutor how oftentimes these folks who are offending over and over and over again in and out of jail, they talk to each other. They know what the policies are. And they know that, hey, they can flee if the police start chasing them. And so then what happens? People flee police more and we catch criminals less often. And that's to a detriment to public safety. And so I think actually Apple Valley Police Department had to change some of their chase procedures because of how often people were starting to flee in relation to their policy. And so those are the types of things that people like Mary Moriarty unfortunately don't understand.
Joe, Becky, if I may, just a quick second. Joe, I wanted to ask you, you're a smart guy. You went to Harvard. You worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office. You've done work prosecuting at the county level too, so various aspects of the criminal justice system. But I want to talk to you a second about one of the things that I took from your op-ed was there are real life consequences when prosecutors and county attorneys make these types of decisions. And I wonder if you could speak to that for a second, because you have a very strong academic background, but you also have real world practical experience. This seems to be the type of thing that reads really good in like some academic study maybe, but has real world practical implications. Can you talk about how you balance that? Because one of the things I think is really impressive is your legal career, your academic career, but also your real world experience. Explain to me because one of the things I'm challenged with about Mary Moriarty is she ran this way. She said she was going to kind of lead in this way, but a lot of the things that she comes up with seem to be outside of what is kind of on the ground and what people are experiencing. And there's a part of me that thinks that she needs to kind of touch the grass a little bit more. Is that fair? And give some perspective on how someone with her background and pedigree makes this type of decision.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head or it's a massive understatement that she needs to touch the grass a little bit more. She, from what I understand, was a failed public defender, then somehow got herself to be elected Hennepin County Attorney. I mean, there are real world consequences to this, not least of which is that police officers are going to respond accordingly, unfortunately. And they're just in this really tough situation where now they know that if they find a bunch of fentanyl in a car after they stop it for a low-level traffic violation, it's probably not going to go anywhere, investigation-wise or prosecution-wise. So what's going to happen? What incentive structure do they have? And so they're likely not going to take those steps that a good, investigator or police officer are going to do. So that's going to lead to less seizures, less fentanyl and methamphetamine poison in our society taken off the streets. So yeah, there is a balance between, okay, looking at what the studies are and then real world experience, of course. But it seems as though Mary Moriarty hasn't really talked to police officers who are in really tough positions to keep us safe. I mean, I was just watching the press conference of, I think it was the president of the Hennepin County Police Chief Association, but many of the big police organizations in Minnesota, to include the Minnesota Peace and Police Officers Association, came out against this. Yes, for all the policy reasons that I've spent a bunch of time now just talking about, but also about the process. Mary Moriarty, I think as of a few weeks before she unveiled this policy, these police groups reached out to her and said, hey, is there any update on this low-level traffic policy of not charging felonies from them? Is there any update to that, Mary Moriarty? And she said, no updates. And then 2 weeks later, she came out with this policy and didn't really talk through with them about what would happen, how it would be, what it was going to look like, and how to onboard it, all these different things. So it's just really, really unfortunate that she just, I guess, was talking to some small insular circle. And maybe now, since she's sort of in a lame duck period of her time as Hennepin County attorney, because she's not going to run, she feels more, open and free to do what she really wants to do. And I guess to her credit, I'll say that Mary Moriarty ran on this stuff, and now she's doing it. And that's unfortunate for the people of Hennepin County.
You mentioned, and obviously you have the experience, that these stops do tend to have it in at times uncover major crimes. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but my TikTok comes across all sorts of body cams, traffic cam footage of situations where it was a simple pullover and then the driver is acting suspicious. And next thing you know, there is a mass of guns or drugs or a dead body in the trunk. And, things that are uncovered because of the interaction with a criminal that would have never been come to light because of if they just let them go for, running a light or speeding or whatever that might be. So this really does, like you say, have potential to lead to more crimes being committed, crimes not being uncovered, and more weapons or drugs on our streets.
Yeah, criminals, unfortunately, are going to feel emboldened by this because they understand what policy shifts are happening. I mean, they understand even when there's a reduction in the type of sentences that they might get for certain crimes, they understand that. I mean, I've listened to, unfortunately, maybe 1,000 hours or so of jail calls of one criminal talking to another about which judges they want to give them a sentence because they understand who's going to be a light sentencer. They understand, who different prosecutors might be in a certain case, all these different things that they understand. So they certainly understand shifts in policy like this. So now it's going to be free reign in Hennepin County. And I remember having a lot of around the water cooler conversations amongst my fellow federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office and down in Nicollet County when I was a state prosecutor. It was just astounding how often, we might get someone with 20 pounds of meth or 10 pounds of meth or a bunch of illegal drugs, and they were caught after just like rolling a stop sign. And we all thought to ourselves, well, I'm not a drug dealer for sure, but if I was, I suppose I'd make sure that my tabs are up to date. I'd make sure that I'm not rolling through stop signs. And that's just astounding. But, I remember a case, just to give you an example of this kid, I believe he was here illegally. So an illegal immigrant, young kid, maybe 20 years old from Mexico. He was driving on one of the side roads near the Mall of America, and his truck looked suspicious. I believe the truck went over the center line a couple times, had a bunch of stuff in the bed of the truck, including some suitcases. And the body cam showed the officer going up, pulling him over. The kid comes out, and the officer, starts searching through the car, through the luggage in the back. And as soon as the officer grabbed the piece of luggage, that invariably had I think it was about 20 pounds of meth and a couple illegal guns. The kid runs down the highway, and fortunately for us, he was wearing flip-flops and he got tackled. But that's one of those cases where a bunch of meth and drugs were found from a low-level traffic violation, and by policy, Mary Moriarty isn't going to charge it. And it's not to say that, even to give her policy some credit, okay, there's exceptions, right? But it's very, very clear that it's going to be a harder burden to prove cases like that, and the harder you make that, it's going to make charging less and less common, and you're going to have police officers less and less even feeding those cases to the county attorney's office to charge.
Just for context for our listeners, Timothy McVeigh, who was involved in the Oklahoma City bombing, he was stopped by law enforcement because his back license plate was missing. That's what led to him being captured in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, was the fact that his rear license plate was missing. And so routine traffic stops have saved, not only have they removed drugs, guns, they've saved lives. And it's just from a historical context, I wanted to kind of bring up an example that I think Joe is referring to that he's seen in real life. One of the things that I think is so fascinating about this and challenging is I think that the experiment of Mary Moriarty being elected, and Joe, you mentioned it too, and Becky and I have talked about this on the podcast. She ran on many of these kind of concepts. I don't think she was as specific as this one when she was running, but this experiment of this type of approach to law enforcement and the judicial system, I think is an experiment that sadly the people in Hennepin County have had to endure, and they're going to do it for the rest of Mary Moriarty's term, but it's truly failed. And it's failed in a cataclysmic way. It's failed so much that people like Keith Ellison are now wading into that stuff. Joe, talk for a second as you view law enforcement and the criminal justice system from your experience at the state level, county attorney, the levels in which you've been involved, all the way up to the U.S. Attorney's Office. What this Mary Moriarty kind of overall experiment has meant for the state.
I mean, it's been horrible for the state. It unfortunately means that other folks who are not at the state level, but at the federal level, like I was for almost 4 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office, has to kind of fill the gap for the failures of the state. So all these cases, illegal drugs, guns, of course, and it's just so sad because so often when we have these shootings that occur, these shootings are done in many cases by felons who have guns, which is already illegal. So if those folks were more often held accountable, that would at least be a deterrent effect on them. So they know in the future, they're going to get in trouble and they're going to less likely do that crime. But also they're going to be incapacitated. They're going to be in jail. They're not going to be able to do that if they're behind bars. So that's something that we had to do as a federal government, come in and charge a lot of these gun crimes at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Every single federal prosecutor, no matter if they were focused on white collar crimes or other Indian country cases or what have you, were charging gun cases because Mary Moriarty wasn't doing it. And this is just really, really not good for public policy. I mean, one thing I didn't even get to is we're talking about low level traffic violations that might happen because a cop is doing their job, pull someone over. But sometimes cops, as a part of a larger investigation, do this thing called a pretext stop. And it sounds bad because it's using the word pretext, which kind of sounds negative, but in many circumstances, there's a larger investigation. Maybe local cops are working with the federal government, the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, focused on drugs. And maybe they have a source of information that gave them intel about someone being a big drug dealer. And oftentimes that source, that's a person. Oftentimes that's maybe an ex-girlfriend who's abused, or it might be someone who's addicted to drugs, who's trying to get off drugs and trying to get their life right, and is a source of intel for us. And we want to protect that. We don't want to tell the target, the defendant, and their attorney that this investigation came actually really from this intel source. And so what cops do is they do what's called a pretext stop, which they see a car going, they know that, okay, this blue truck might have some meth in it. This guy might be a meth dealer, but we see him veering over the line. And so the U.S. Constitution, Supreme Court says this is constitutional. Let's pull over the car, not because we suspect that he's a meth dealer, but because he's going over the line, because he is, or if he's got expired tabs, because he does. And that's what they do. And it's helpful to protect the investigation so that these things can happen in the first place. So those are things that aren't going to happen likely or happen as often under Mary Moriarty's watch. And it's meant a lot of the federal government folks like myself before, when I was a federal prosecutor, had to fill in those gaps. And it's just not good for our system.
Your op-ed, you mentioned, reading from it, says Moriarty's policy strips law enforcement of the effective tool, making impactful policing more difficult. Improving policing doesn't mean tying officers' hands behind their back. It means holding them to a high standard. $1 million question here. Are there other ways for us to be able to build back up some of that trust, reduce some of that inherent or, racial bias that exists and that there's of concern in that. You mentioned, obviously it doesn't just exist in police, it exists in society. And I think, are aware of that. But how do we, if this isn't the answer, which to me, I didn't write this op-ed, but I fully believed it was not the answer before, and even more so now after reading this. Talk to us about that part of it, about how there is, there's a desire to do something, but we can't tie their hands.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good impetus, and that's why even in the article I say, Moriarty, at best, her motivations are naive, because let's just say that her goal is to reduce the effects of racial bias in our society, which I talk about in the article. This is not the way to do it. I mean, I think Moriarty has to understand what her job is. Right? Her job is not a legislator. Her job is not to enact policy. That's someone else's job. Her job is to prosecute criminals and is to enforce the law. And so by her deciding that she's just going to carve out this whole area, that's not doing anyone favors. And so I think what police want, as I have many great relationships with law enforcement, they say they just want to be held to a high standard, like we all want to, right? It's kind of disrespectful for anyone in their profession to not want to be held to a high standard. That's what police want for themselves. So yes, if there are instances where they break the law, they should be held accountable. Of course, we should be putting more resources into training and rooting out the bad apples that exist in a police force as they exist in any other large organization. I think those are the ways you get there. And then looking at what our criminal justice system looks like with accountability and with sentences, I think it's not good that our system takes so long for someone to get sentenced and actually start serving time. I think a lot of the data shows that it's not necessarily the length of punishment that deters crime, but it's actually the certainty and the swiftness of that. So in other words, if someone does a crime and then gets sentenced 3 or 4 years afterwards, there's less of a direct connection there. But if somehow we had a system where you commit a crime and you start doing the time for that crime not long afterwards, obviously subject to due process and making sure that people have a constitutional right to that, that's going to be much more effective for deterring crime, a lot more so than even like expanding the length of any given sentence. Because if someone's committing a crime, they're not often thinking, oh gosh, well, I realize that the sentence for this is now going to be 15 years instead of 12 years. So I'm going to be a little bit less likely to commit it. Maybe not so much. But if they realize they are going to get caught, that is going to be more of a deterrent effect. All these things I've been talking about, these are policy things in terms of policymakers, people in the state house, state senate, U.S. Congress, our political branches, not the county attorney.
That was an A+ question and an A+ answer, and it's exactly why I love having a podcast. Great question, Becky. Great answer. And one second. Excuse me. Very impressed by that exchange. I just have one thing I wanted to go back to was, Joe, you made a really important statement that I want our listeners to remember and understand. Criminals read the newspaper. Criminals follow the news. These are very sophisticated organizations. And so one of the things that I think is so concerning about this is it really advertises, and I understand the debate and this type of academic discussion about it, but one of the challenges I think, and Becky and I have talked about this in the context of the upcoming elections, that I think that one of the issues that's going to come up is, waste, fraud, and abuse. Becky and I have talked about it in the context of the governor's race, and Becky and I have kind of agreed that this next election, this governor's race, will certainly be a referendum on Walz's past 8 years and where he wants to go for the next 4. But from a crime and justice perspective, I just keep going back to how out of touch I think this experiment is. And one of the, I hate to say it this way, but one of the benefits of some of this bad policy is that I think there's going to be a course correction. I wish there wasn't this type of bad policy, but it's going to bring out more of, I think, a common sense approach to criminal justice that needs to happen in terms of prosecuting crimes. I mean, Mary Moriarty is not seeking re-election as county attorney, in large part because I think what she ran on and what she did certainly don't match up. I don't think, and I know she announced this policy recently, but I don't think this was anything that she campaigned on. But she did campaign as very progressive when it would come to prosecuting cases and how she would deal with them. But I think that what we've seen, I think her time in office will be remembered as an experiment that just really failed.
Yeah, it failed. It failed horribly. I mean, I think
And that's
I'm
sad.
biased to say,
And I think I want to just be clear. That's sad, because in order for her to fail, there are people in Hennepin County have to not have the level of the criminal justice system on their side that they need.
yeah, unfortunately, we've kind of seen this play out in many other big cities. I know I have friends in, San Francisco who, dealing with policy guidance of, hey, roll down your windows so that when you park a car, no one smashes your window and to steal your stuff. I mean, policies have consequences. I just have vivid memories of listening to jail calls, like I mentioned, of offenders going in and out of the system, being fully aware of which judge they get and knowing that that judge has a rap for low sentences and having nicknames for those judges and things like that. I mean, it has a real tangible effect on policy. And it is sad that we're seeing this. I mean, I have a lot of pride for the work that I did at the U.S. Attorney's Office and how we did feel like we filled the gap for what happened in the county. So I think mitigating some of those effects. But hey, look, if the feds weren't there, what would have happened regarding all this fraud, the Feeding Our Future fraud, all this fraud that's now being uncovered? Like, I don't think Tim Walz wouldn't have done anything on that. Keith Ellison wouldn't have done anything on that. We wouldn't have known that, but for the federal government coming in.
Joe, one last thing on this topic I want to ask you. Is it, and I want you to answer this from your experience in prosecuting cases, when a county attorney makes this type of decision, and again, the internet's on the computer, we know that the criminals read the media, explain in real terms to our listeners what this kind of announcement means for attracting a criminal element.
Yeah, I mean, I think it means, I'm not sure if someone from Chicago is going to move to Minneapolis because they think it's just that much better to commit crimes, right? But I think for the folks who are here, they're just going to realize that they can get away with a lot more. And so that is going to make it such that they're going to be able to commit more crimes. I mean, maybe they're going to do more drug dealing in Hennepin County than in other counties. Maybe that's where they set up their drug deals more often. Maybe that's where they set up their stash houses more often. Oftentimes drug dealers have certain spots or areas where they're going to keep their stash of drugs. Right now, if you were a drug dealer, you'd put it in Hennepin County and not in Scott County or not in Dakota County or not other places where there are functional, competent, good county attorneys. And again, the really big effect on this is going to be also on police officers because they're going to be so disincentivized to really investigate these cases hard. It's not going to be their fault. And this kind of happens already. I mean, I've seen it in talking to cops saying hey, well, Mary's not going to charge this. So we're just not going to talk to this witness or that witness when they know the investigation is going to go nowhere. It's very, very disheartening. Morale can go down because of that. And, public safety is going to go down because of it as well.
Thank you for writing this piece, for being such a strong voice against this. I mean, we're glad that she is not running for another term, but it doesn't necessarily mean these problems go away. So, we'll have to watch what happens and hopefully chat with you more after we know a little bit more of the potential impacts that this is having on crime and on our communities. But speaking of terms, you are, this summer it was announced that you are the new co-chair of the organization U.S. Term Limits. Talk to us a little bit about what this organization is, how you became co-chair, and I guess your overall stance on term limits.
Yeah, I think term limits is one of these issues where it's kind of crazy to think that, okay, what issues are out there that over 80% of Americans agree on? We like puppies, we like, NFL, and we want term limits. Like those things are,
and turkey,
turkey, all the good things. It's a situation where historic levels of debt, we have historic level, polarization. Our government isn't working for us. You can say all these talking points and people can kind of live it, right? And we know that. But there's something that we can simply do with some hard work, and it's term limits on our politicians who are way too incentivized to just do things to get along, to stay in office, to get reelected. And so I think that's why I was really proud to join and be the Minnesota's co-chair for U.S. term limits, to say, look, let's put term limits on members of Congress and the Senate. So let's say, 2 terms for the Senate, so that's going to be a max of 12 years, and 3 terms for U.S. House members, so that's going to be 6 years. The way we get there is by changing our Constitution, which the Constitution itself has a mechanism for. And in Article 5, if we can get 2/3 of the states to convene a convention for the specific purpose of a constitutional amendment to allow for term limits, we can make that happen. And then 3/4 of the states would then have to ratify that. And right now, I think we're around 12 states that have done that. Minnesota's not one of them yet, and we can get there. We do that by reaching out to people who are running for office to sign pledges to say, look, I'm going to be in support of this. And so right now, we need the Minnesota state legislature, the state house and the state Senate to do this. That's what the Constitution calls for. And I think, our system is broken and we need to change the incentive structure. We need to reduce polarization. We need to reduce the effect of special interests. And I think if we have more of a citizen legislature kind of concept, we can get there.
Becky, your take on term limits.
I was going to throw it to you because I think you have some strong thoughts on it.
So I've really fallen into this position, and the position is that politics, and I was talking with my wife right before we did this episode because she knows I have a strong opinion about term limits. But Joe makes a really good point on that. And one of the points I want to make is I think that something needs to change in this political climate. Something needs to change in this political discourse. And as Joe was talking, as we were doing prep for this show, I really started to think that this could be an idea, a concept that could really change, just shake up the system. And I hope that there's a broad discussion on this because I think we need something like this. I think we're at a real critical point in our country where we need to talk to each other differently. And having this kind of discussion and kind of prepping for this, I was like, if there was a shakeup in a term limit type system, that would force people into talking in different ways. And that's something that I think ultimately needs to change. And so I'm going to look at it very seriously, but I think it's a great discussion. And I hope it gets legs because this is the type of kind of meaty policy discussion I think our country needs right now, a substantive discussion. I love these type of constitutional debates. And this is one where I think I could be won over on.
I'll ask you, why do most state governor's mansions, most state legislatures have a term limit for governors? Like, why do we now have a 2-term limit for president? I think there's a reason why we want talent to go in and out. And I hear the argument about, okay, well, we want the argument is the best and the brightest, the most experience. And once you're there, you can kind of gain experience. You can bring those benefits to your constituents. I guess I can understand some of those arguments. I think the biggest way to combat that is say, where's that gotten us? Where are we at right now? And that things can change.
That right there is absolutely the best point, because if the system was working so well the way it is, we wouldn't be in this mess that we're in right now. And that's absolutely a great point.
Yeah. And plus, I've lived this myself. I ran for U.S. Congress and I ran against Angie Craig in the 2nd District. And, the power of incumbency is extremely strong. Once you're in there, you start making connections to people, different special interests, and they have an incentive to back the person that they believe is going to win. And at some point, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the person who's likely going to win is going to get even more support. And so do we want a system where the power of incumbency is so high that I think the rate now is, over 90%. And I think we want it a little bit different. I think we want some people to go in and out, to be all different kinds of professions. I think you're going to make Congress a lot more diverse, actually, both from a demographic perspective, generation perspective, vocational perspective. Let's mix it up a lot more rather than just, a lawyer like me running for Congress, of course, but not just lawyers. We want everyone in there, right? We want homemakers. We want engineers. We want plumbers. We want everyone to be running for Congress or to be representing us, to represent our interests.
Becky, this may be the fastest policy shift that I've ever had on one of our episodes here. He's making fantastic points.
He certainly is. And I'm going to agree with some of them and then play devil's advocate. I wholly agree. Our system is broken. We've gotten to a point where we have some members who have been in their 30 plus years where the landscape has changed so much. And these people no longer have, while they might have great relationships with constituents, they haven't lived a quote unquote normal life in 3 decades, and I think it really just puts them so out of touch with what real people, real families, real workers are thinking and feeling. I think that as well, especially being a younger Republican, I think that there are significant policies that our parties on both sides are standing behind that no longer represent the majority of folks in their party at times because of that age that we look at when we look at Congress, and the age that's represented out there is way older than the majority of Americans. And so I think there are certainly benefits that come from this. Playing devil's advocate, though, do term limits set us up to a situation where there are some elected officials are simply puppets or just face and figureheads, where the staff behind the scenes then becomes the institutional knowledge and folks that are working there for 30-40 years and kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes and no longer really have that electoral certificate, electionist certificate, and accountable to the American people.
I hear that argument. I mean, I view it as the people who are currently in power are already being moved by people behind the scenes. And these are people who are behind the scenes with money, because unfortunately money is just is just a driver of politics. And so I don't know why, staff who might be there longer than the elected member would have somehow some bigger influence than the people who are already having a big influence because of the fact we don't have term limits. So I think term limits is just way too much common sense. I think we have a history of changing our Constitution where it makes sense. I know there are some hearty debate, especially amongst Republicans, about the direct election of senators, but that's something that wasn't originally in the Constitution, and we changed that, I think, after the populist movement. And I think that this is another one of those changes that wasn't originally in the Constitution and that should be changed.
Joe, what you're missing here is what you're missing from a context perspective is Becky was a high-rolling congressional staffer, and so she's really focused on making
For
sure
3 years.
people like her are going to be able to still be able to pull the strings. So that's what she's concerned about.
Shouldn't she then be in favor of term limits?
There you go.
People
There you
in
go.
her
There you go.
position
You want
have
us
more
both
power?
over.
I mean, come on.
You want us
It
both
is one
over.
that I waver on because I see so many benefits, and it is that constitutional mindset of a Republican that I struggle with. I think you might be winning me over here because I think also when we're looking for new people to run for office, and like you said, not just attorneys, not just folks with money, not just certain backgrounds, it's less of a heavy lift. Not saying that 6 years is a minimal amount of time by any means, but it is less of a heavy lift to think about going into something for a handful of years, and then you could come back and return to your career, your profession, your life in your home state, in your district, without having to essentially be pissing off people that if you're in a safe seat and you're not willing to run again, and all of that pressure that comes from just wanting to keep people there time and time again. You mentioned in the press release I read about your announcement, it says that over 80% of Americans, regardless of political affiliation, support congressional term limits. That is significant, although it seems like a pretty heavy lift to get to the 2/3. Any time frame you've got on this? Do we think this is something we would hope to see in the next 4-8 years, or is it something that's just going to continue to push forward, gather the coalition, build it up, and see when we can get there?
Yeah, I think there is a good movement now. I mean, I know we're at 12 states. I don't want to put a firm number of years on it. I mean, I think it very much is attainable, and we have a history of this, of when this movement of convening a convention to change the Constitution, when we're right at the precipice, we need 34 states, but right before that, that's when actually Congress can take action. And because that's the other mechanism for changing the Constitution, is just getting Congress to call this convention. But they're not really incentivized to do so unless they're pressured. And so that's why really the main thrust of this, and the most likely way we get there, is we get a number of states, maybe just up to 34, to convene a constitutional convention on the specific issue, and then Congress can call for this and make it happen.
I got to tell you, this is why another reason why I love to have a podcast, because I knew you were coming on, Joe. I kind of did, had some discussions in the House. I did some reading on it, but you made some fantastic points that really tie into where I'm at right now, kind of politically. And I applaud you for being a part of it. And whenever there's news, and I think it's a subject that we should maybe have a broader discussion on, because you just made some really good points. You're very effective. Good job being a state chair.
Hey, there we go. Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
Joe, we want to thank you for being here today, and we'll make sure to link to your social media platforms and stay in contact. But one other thing I just wanted to compliment you on, which I always like to do. I'm going to sound like a broken record and an old man. I'm so appreciative of when people, even when I disagree with them, commit themselves to the long form and submit stuff, those op-eds. Become much more of a fan of letters to the editors and larger op-eds. And I really want to just applaud you for, in this kind of digital age of TikTok and everything else going on, that you committed yourself to the long form and you're out there talking about issues in such a thoughtful way. It's what we need right now in this state. And I hope we see more of that from you in the coming weeks and months.
You bet. No, and I appreciate the long form of having me on here with Becky and yourself, Michael, and I really appreciate the time. Really great conversation.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
Becky, we just finished an interview with Joe Teirab about an op-ed he wrote regarding some policing policies or enforcement policies related to Mary Moriarty, and his work as the state chair of a pro-term limits group. Your take on the interview?
I think it's great to speak to Joe again. We spoke with him when he was running for the 2nd Congressional District. He's a smart guy. I mean, being able to have, like you said, an op-ed that is so well written, hitting the points in response to, as a commoner op-ed, but hitting that policy and coming at it from someone who has experience in prosecuting these cases and speaking with police officers and working within the system, I think is so important. And it just, like you said, it's one that hard for me to wrap my head around this. Criminals read the news too, or listen and watch the news. They're, these folks, they're understanding what's going to happen. And so now knowing like, I can just, get away with whatever, it's not going to happen. If I ran a red light, but I happen to have a suitcase full of meth, they can't do anything about it. Like they can't do anything about it. It's bonkers to me how that can be. And also how she's making policy from a position that's not supposed to be a policymaker. And isn't there some things that are just more like internal policies rather than broadcasting? I mean, this is clearly something she was hoping to score political points on, right? Like she's clearly trying to make a stance of reducing biases within who is stopped or if there's profiling going on, which, hey, I can applaud that effort. If, like we talked about there, I'm not saying there's not a bias in society or in police forces. And I do think steps need to be taken. Obviously, we saw this following the murder of George Floyd and the reports coming out of the police department and different issues and errors. We need to take steps to make sure that our police officers are good apples, good citizens, good at their job, and being held to a high standard. Absolutely. But prosecuting or just being able to prosecute crimes that are uncovered while these police are doing their jobs is just, it seems like a no-brainer that's not going to work. And I'm glad that Joe has been outspoken about it.
First of all, I think that what was so good about his op-ed was, I think what's going on right now is and I think Joe is just a perfect person to talk about this, is we're really kind of peeling the onion back on where our state is at. And, we talked about in a little bit of the interview, waste, fraud, and abuse, some of those other subjects, but particularly when it comes to criminal justice and where we are as a state in terms of public safety. I think Joe's op-ed did a really good job of kind of laying out the arguments as to why this is so bad. And again, I want to be respectful. I think, I don't live in Hennepin County. I'm appreciative. I live in Dakota County, and I think it's one of the best counties in the state to live in. I feel bad that this experiment that's going on in Hennepin County, which has not worked out, I think. While it's important the people of Hennepin County are suffering because of it. And again, not to be hyper partisan or cast aspersions at anyone, but Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, had to dial her back a bit. And that kind of shows you kind of how far out of the mainstream I think she is, or how far out of step she is with law enforcement and where she falls in, where she thinks her office falls in line with that. It's an experiment that I think has failed, and there's repercussions of it failing, meaning people in Hennepin County don't feel as safe and don't feel like they have as responsive of a criminal justice system as they should. And I think that this experiment of Mary Moriarty, her time in office will be marked as, I think in many ways, as an example of how not to approach the office. And I know that it's something that you and I've discussed at length, is she campaigned this way. She may not have campaigned on this particular issue, but she campaigned in being this way. And so there was a bit of a truth in advertising as to how she would be. But the real world ramifications of it are, as I think there are a lot of people in Hennepin County who feel that she's out of step from where the rest of the county is. Law enforcement feels that way. And if we could connect the two subjects for a second, one of the things I think that Joe is making, and the point that you were kind of making too about term limits, is one of the arguments to have that is people are forced to kind of go out and touch the grass and have real world experience. And I think it's pretty clear to me that Mary Moriarty needs some of that kind of touch the grass experience to be out there more in the community, because I don't know that there is the community support that she thinks is there for some of these policies.
I'm with you. All
I
right.
should disclose that I snuck one past Joe on the whole turkey thing. He later said, and I'm not violating his confidence, but he said off air that he's more of a ham sandwich guy than he was turkey. But
Whoop, whoop.
I want to set the record straight.
I disclosed that I did have a delicious honey glazed ham at the cabin this weekend. It was fantastic.
Glad you had a nice subpar.
It was delicious. I'll
That's
save some
great.
for you next time.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
You bet. Last topic here is touching on a recent Republican panel. So the Star Tribune held or hosted a North Star Summit 2025 on Tuesday this week. And during it, there was a session called The Future of the Republican Party. Panelists included former Governor Tim Pawlenty, and then State Senators Zach Duckworth and Julia Coleman, who was just on our podcast last week. I went back and watched it after you sent me an article on it. Great conversation. I think the panelists itself was a great group of panelists of both Zach Duckworth and Julia Coleman. Senators Duckworth and Senators Coleman are two individuals who have been great newer voices for the Republican Party. I think that they have both done incredibly well in their roles at the Senate. And as a big part of the conversation was about Trump and Trump in the Republican Party and what that means for the Republican Party here in Minnesota. I think they all kind of agreed to the fact that emulating President Trump, acting like President Trump here in Minnesota is not a winning formula, especially as the reformer says, include that out as well. And should be noted that both Coleman and Duckworth outperformed Trump in their districts in 2022. What's your take on this part of the conversation, seemingly in line with what we've been discussing over the last couple of years?
It is seemingly in line. And I look for these type of points, not just to have confirmation bias, but one of the good things about having this podcast is on a regular basis, we have people on that disagree with us. You and I disagree on a number of things. But we have people on that disagree with us. And, one of the things that we try to do is make sure while it's our show, it's our names, we get to decide the kind of the programming. We, I think, do a very good job of making sure that we have diverse viewpoints on this show and that on this podcast. And that includes viewpoints that disagree with us on where the party's at and where it's going. But one thing that I want to hone in on is one of the questions that I consistently ask, and I asked this, just had conversations this week about it. Is Donald Trump a net asset? Does he help Republicans in this state? And the answer that I consistently get is no. That doesn't mean that they're not, again, that passionate Trump supporters are not an integral part of what it takes for Republicans to win statewide in the state. I absolutely believe that to be true. But whether him as a brand being aligned with a candidate, does it help in the suburbs? And here you had two legislators who outperformed Donald Trump in the suburbs in the exact areas that you and I have talked about. Was one of the focuses we wanted to have of this podcast, which is how do Republicans continue to, one of the the topic points we wanted to discuss is why do Republicans keep losing in the suburbs? And I think this discussion that the Star Tribune had really reinforces a point that we've made. And it's not confirmation bias, because whether it's been Kip Christensen or John Rouleau or people all across the political spectrum, whether it's been, we've spoken about Senator Duckworth and Senator Coleman. These are discussions that we've had, and we asked them, and the answers are generally the same. There are some organizational benefits of working closely with the Trump campaign in the last election cycle that I think benefited Minnesota. But overall, I'm the kind of Republican who thinks that there's a path for Republicans to win in this state, but it can't just be through the Donald Trump identified lane.
Absolutely. I think that Senator Coleman kind of went a little bit more into some of the conversation that we had with her. And listening back, I took some of the notes talking about how she said that in the time since the Hortman assassination, one of the things that she's reflected on and noted is how good Speaker Hortman and Democrats are at coalition building, and something Republican needs to really lean into and opening up the tent. And she talks a little bit about we need to stop saying that college campuses are off limits, that we need to go into different communities and meet people where they are, and that we just currently don't have the luxury of infighting in the Republican Party here in Minnesota, because we don't have the luxury of pushing anybody out, because we currently don't have enough people on our side to win. And so we just don't have that luxury to say you are not welcome in our party. If somebody wants to be in our party, let them be in our party. But you have to do so with having that conversation and making sure that we are. I think I'm not the mathematician here, but if you look at the numbers, the Trump voters just don't always show up for everybody. And
Correct.
so we can't guarantee that those people that come out and vote for President Trump are going to come out for other ones. So we need to make sure that we are also getting some of those other folks. We're getting some of the independents. We're getting some of those swing voters. We're getting the moderate Republicans that maybe don't show up and vote for President Trump and will come out in the off years. We're, just a little over 13 months away, which is wild, from the next election. And we really need to make sure that Republicans are having those conversations in the suburbs. And then the last thing that I really thought that she hit on and went a little bit more in depth on was one of the things that we chatted with her about again, is about folks who are not Donald Trump supporters, or at least not fully MAGA voters in the Republican Party, still need to show up, still need to be an active part of the Republican Party. She had said that personal responsibility is going to be a big thing to change this for Republicans in our state. Went into about how if I'm not able to or willing to bring 30 people to caucus, if I'm not able to, or part of the problem is just going and pandering to the people who already show up. So if we haven't she said, if you haven't come out and caucus because you feel the party is leaving you, if you're frustrated about where the party is going, then this is quote, damn it, roll up your sleeves, spend 2 Saturdays to take the party back. And I think it is a good reminder. And I said, this on when we chatted with her, that this last caucus or this last election cycle didn't go out to caucus because I was turned off about it all. I didn't participate in the party structure as it stands, because I don't align myself with what the President Trump party is. But she's right. I mean, if we really need to change that party structure, it's going to take folks like me, folks like you, other folks to show up and change it from within, because it's not just going to change on its own. And so we really need to take a role of making our voices heard of what these candidates are and who, because I think we can both agree that Royce White is not, from the policies that he stands for and the way he conducts himself. President Trump is not necessarily the type of policy or the type of candidate that I stand behind and how I want them to conduct themselves and represent our party. And so I do think it was a good introspection for me of how I want to move as we move forward, and maybe be a little bit more vocal backing what I will call my sensible Republican crew.
I think that's a great position. I really identified a lot with what this panel said. I watched it. I'm glad you did too. One thing I want to remind our listeners is that I think, and we discussed this last election cycle, Royce White won not because he cheated. He won because those were open seats that people like, respectfully, you and I didn't engage people. And I don't mean just you and I, but I mean people like us. I think that just you and I are in a similar age group from this context of there's a group of people in kind of our demographic, in our kind of circles that have just continually backed away from getting involved in the party, and that needs to change if we want this party to change its direction. And I think it's something that a lot of us need to do some soul searching on, and I know I have. And next week, I don't want to discuss it in this episode because I wanted it to just be about this, but I want to talk about some things that I've started to do related to that subject that we can talk about. But I think that I really wanted to, in this thing, draw attention to this panel, this discussion, because I think there is so much meat there for people like us and others who you and I both know, who in professional circles have kind of fallen out of the party and want there to be some different things. I also think there are some reforms that the party could make, moving the primary, getting rid of the caucus system, a whole host of things that I think could be beneficial. But this was a great panel, and I'm going to talk more next week about some of the stuff that I'm doing. And I wanted to give this panel its due attention. Okay.
Can't wait.
I'm always up to something.
Always up to something.
And sometimes it's trouble, but sometimes it's good. I think this is good.
What you are not up to.
Oh, come on. When did I set myself up for that?
Yeah. Is on the leaderboard of our Pick'ems League. Although last week was brutal across the board. The person who came out on top, we had a couple people tied for first, my husband included, in weekly picks, and that number was 7. They got 7 of the games correct.
7 out of 16 games.
Is pretty brutal. I got 6, you got 5. So I just want to repeat that real quick. I got 6, you got 5.
I got 5. So that
would break up our tie.
So you are ahead. You are ahead by 1 point right now. Ben Golick is leading. You by 2, me by 3.
Yeah. And so I am in a solo second. You're in a solo third place currently.
Yes, we are in a tight spot. Our spouses are tied. This is a real spicy league this year.
It really is a spicy league.
Yes, and so again, my rule is as long as my first objective is to make sure you don't win, okay, and then it's about me. So my strategy is working so far. I can't say that yours is, but my strategy is working so far.
But I'm beating you, which is part of my strategy. So
that's good. That is good. Yes. The other thing is I continue to dominate in my family fantasy football league. It's really, the excellence that just continues to come from me is just profound. And this is neck and neck. Week by week, we're going to be at each other's throats. I'm going to be texting and watching this as it continues. The Vikings have a bye this week. They're coming back from Europe, but we got a big game coming up 10 days from now, a little longer than that, against the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. I'll be watching your picks very closely. I have a feeling that you won't be going with the Vikings that week, but I continue. One of the things that I'm bound by is my loyalty to the Vikings, as I consider myself as a season ticket holder, a part owner of the franchise. So
there you go.
Well, Becky, I want to thank you for doing this again, and I also want to remind our listeners that we've cranked out a number of extra episodes in the last couple of weeks. We did an episode with Representative Nolan West, Senator Julia Coleman. We did an episode last week with Rick Capcella talking about his new documentary, Precarious State. And I also did one with Ellie Nangan talking about some school safety issues in White Bear Lake. I encourage you to look at some of the back catalog of our episodes because there's some great ones there. I want to thank you, Becky, for being here today. And I also want to thank everyone else for joining us for this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website and across all social media platforms at BB Breakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you so much for joining us.
Bye.